And I'm going to introduce right now Eric Rosenthal from Rapyd, and he's going to take it over from here and talk about going beyond the box.
Thanks, guys. It's a relatively small audience, so what I'll probably do is those of you that are here are probably here because you really wanted to hear about what we're discussing. So I'll leave some room for some time. So I'm Eric Rosenthal, I'm the Managing Director of Rapyd here in the Americas. Rapyd is an Israeli-based company that has offices in Singapore, London, and California. And we're going to talk about going beyond the box and beyond the card today. So how many of you actually are trying to sell internationally or are happenstancely selling internationally? Just one person in the room? No one else has any cross-border going on? How many of you are interested in trying to build an Amazon Cash-like a product that would allow your buyers to be able to hold a balance with you and draw down a balance and essentially prepay the subscriptions? Well, this session is then for you today. So what many people don't realize is that particularly outside of the United States and even inside of the United States, that there's about 4.5 billion people that don't have a credit card. So what we typically are hearing in all of our discussions with merchants, whether in the subscription business or not subscription business, is by default, we have a knee-jerk reaction to think that everyone in the world is using a credit card and everyone has a credit card because that's our reality. But that's not necessarily the reality that exists outside of the United States. Currently happening all over the world, you have a proliferation of what are called real-time payment networks, essentially enabling people to make real-time payments, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's in India, whether it's actually soon to be in the UK, will actually become a primary form of payment in many different places in the world. This is happening for a variety of reasons. Number one is that many governments are realizing that they do not want their card transactions or their payments transactions, better said, to be running through US government or through the US territory. They're also recognizing that the fees for merchants are very high. In order to proliferate and to facilitate global e-commerce, that they want to lower the fees. So you're seeing in many, many countries, over the next 2 to 3 years, we're expected to see 61 different countries that are going to have national payment systems that are real time. And these will be replacing, ultimately, the card rails. The other thing that you're seeing all over the world is that while we may have heard stories about M-Pesa, there's approximately 200 different mobile wallets in the world today. There's approximately about 40 of them that have more than 1 million users, and in some cases, the likes of Alipay, WeChat Pay have millions and millions of users, upwards of over 300 to 400 million users. But yet, all of us, typically when we're thinking about our payment strategy, are thinking about something very different. So once you get outside of the US, what you're finding is that about 19% of online payments are actually done in cash. How does that actually happen? It is typically someone that is paying for something, checking out, and then has the option to go to 7-Eleven, has the option to go to OXXO in Mexico, has the option to go to some convenience store and pay for something that they've essentially teed up in the checkout flow. As well, about 34% of the transactions are happening in ATM. How does that happen? It means that you can literally go to an ATM and you have a transaction code that you need to pay for. Go to the ATM, put in your card at the ATM, and you can authenticate the transaction and push it through. And other thing that I was describing as well is that real-time payment networks, such as the one that is now exists in India, are now representing close to, in some cases, 30% of all payments done in the country. And over the time that it was actually started to now, which is now less than 2 years, has grown 800%. So what does that actually mean when you're thinking about credit card transactions outside of the US? What it actually means is that many people that have a card, whether it's a debit card or a credit card overseas, their card is not going to work on your website. And the reason it's not going to work on your website is not because you're not using the right credit card acquirer here in the US or you're not using the right acquirer in the US. It's not accepted because the issuing bank, the bank that gave the card to the consumer in Brazil, doesn't want the card to work because it deems it a high-risk transaction, in which case they're declining the transaction. So a typical scenario is that you might have approval rates that are over 90, 95% if someone is paying you with a US credit card or you're paying you with a US debit card. And as soon as someone tries to transact on your site in a country other than the US, the rates could go as low as 50% or even worse. The other problem that you're going to have is if you're trying to optimize for that, what you're typically going to find is that you're going to have credit card acquirers that tell you, oh, that's great, we can set up an entity for you in Brazil. And suddenly you now have to have a Brazilian entity, you now have to have Brazilian tax paying, all of the complications that come along, where if you're just trying to facilitate payments from across the world, that probably doesn't make a ton of sense. So ultimately, it probably doesn't make a ton of sense to be focusing on the cards because the reality of your buyers is not one of cards. So if you're in Brazil and you're shopping online, the way that you're actually paying is very differently. Why is that? Because only 20% of the population of over 230 million people actually have a credit card. If you're in India, only 3% of the total population has a credit card. And if you're in Italy, 42% of the population may have a credit card, but it's actually not how they're paying. So people in Italy, for example, about 60% of the transactions that are taking place online are happening through bank transfers. Someone is logging onto their bank, someone is being directed to a bank redirect, and they're paying using a push-based payment, which coincidentally is chargeback free because it's essentially like paying for something in cash. In India, 80% of the people now shopping online are using UPI, which is the real-time payment network system inside of India to make online payments. And those, in addition to that, about 69% of the people from a survey perspective say that they prefer to actually pay using Paytm, which is a very, very popular mobile wallet in India. So if you're concentrated on credit card, you're not selling to these people. So the notion here was, what exactly is it we mean when we say bank transfer? So you look at this and say, hold on, I'm not going to redirect my user to do an online payment because it's going to kill the conversion. Well, coincidentally enough, if 52% of all transactions happening in Peru are happening through bank transfer and 55% are happening in Colombia using bank transfer, it's because people are accustomed to doing this type of transaction. So the conversion rates are typically not actually impacted whatsoever because it's the way people are used to paying. So what would happen is someone would log on to their bank account in Peru. They would select on payments and transfers. They would be told to enter in the transaction code of where they're actually sending the money to. And then ultimately behind the scenes, this would be hitting a system and confirming payment, and you as a merchant will receive payment confirmation. So the question is, how do we think about our strategy? So if you're not selling internationally now, depending upon the product that you're selling and how you're selling it, you might want to think about going global. And the question that you're typically going to ask is, how do I start? And what we see is that merchants typically think about going global and they look for the big countries. They think about the BRICS. How do I go to Brazil? How do I go to China? How do I go to India? How do I go to South Africa? Because these countries themselves represent about 42% of the global population. Separately, they represent about 50% of all global e-commerce in the world. And ultimately, what you're seeing as well from particularly India and China is they're representing substantial growth. So conversations that we've had with merchants are, why are these people buying cross-border, particularly in a subscription-based model? It could be anything because they don't trust the food where they live, because they can't get the products that you have where they live, because they used to live here and now they want something that they used to have when they're still living over there. So what we would say is that typically what people are doing is they say, let's focus on the BRICS. And ultimately, what most merchants are thinking is, so what I should do is I should talk to First Data, I should talk to Stripe, I should talk to Adyen, I should talk to whoever's doing my credit card processing and begin to go through a process of optimizing auth rates. How do I optimize my authorization rates? You're going to be sold on all types of ideas of how you could do that. You're going to be told that, hey, we can actually give you better conversion rates. We can manage the fraud, given the fact that these are overseas cards. And what we typically find when we talk to merchants that think about this way is that it doesn't actually have the impact, it doesn't really move the needle for them sometime into the future. And that's because, as I discussed earlier, people don't have credit cards. So if you're going and directing your go-to-market strategy of how I'm going to sell cross-border in Brazil, and less than 3% of the population has a credit card, your total addressable market is 3% of the population if you're focusing on credit cards. If you're looking at how do I do cross-border into Mexico and less than 5% of the population has a credit card, your total addressable market is 5% of ultimately approximately 80 million people. Probably not the total addressable market that you would like to be looking at when you're making the investment in localizing your website, figuring out the fulfillment in country, and figuring out actually how to sell to the entire population that could actually afford to buy your product. So what we like to suggest is it makes much more sense to think about diversifying and localizing not only your website, not only your inventory, not only your FX conversion, but ultimately also let people pay the way that they want to be able to pay. If people in Mexico pay with bank transfers, let them pay with a bank transfer. If people in Mexico want to pay with cash, let them pay with cash. If people want to pay with a local card, let them pay with a local card, because it's nothing more frustrating to want to buy and then not be able to transact with you at all. So although this is not necessarily, let's say, a subscription model, the business model as from a payments perspective is very, very similar. So all of us here have heard of Uber, correct? All of us have used Uber. One of the fundamental differences between Uber and Lyft as people living in America is that we said, well, Uber was great because it went global and that's why it's such a bigger company than Lyft is. But interestingly enough, Uber lost in Southeast Asia. They had to sell their business to the local competitor in Southeast Asia. And the reason that they lost was because they didn't localize their payment methods in the grand scheme of things. So while the local player in Southeast Asia said, people in Indonesia don't have credit cards, Uber was transacting using credit card transaction, acquiring the transactions from a European entity, in which case their clients were high, their total addressable market was minimal, and ultimately as well, they didn't respect the local infrastructure and the local reality of how people wanted to pay in Indonesia. The other reason that they lost is because while they were focusing on that, what this company, the other competitor known as Grab, what they did is they said, why don't we actually let people have an Amazon Cash-like experience, which is very much similar to a subscription-based model, which is why don't we let people pay with a bank transfer, let them pay with cash, accumulate a stored value bounce, essentially a virtual gift card bounce, and draw down that bounce so that they can actually have that instantaneous feel of that they can pay all the time and make it feel like a recurring payment. And me as a merchant, I get them to fund in more at a low cost. I get to store that value and therefore, to a certain degree, guarantee the fact that eventually they're going to purchase with me. The reason that everyone likes gift cards is not only does it give you some visibility into what is your sales going to be, but we also like it because when people don't spend, it's still on your balance sheet. You already have acquired that revenue. So they won and Uber lost. Ultimately, what ended up happening is Uber sold the business to Grab and took the entire market. So what we would like to say is, if you're thinking about going cross-border, if you're thinking about selling into other countries, or more importantly, if you're already beginning to witness that people are coming to your sites and they are transacting with you, how do you begin to seize that opportunity? How do you take advantage of the fact that, hey, I wasn't planning on going local and selling into Argentina, but suddenly I'm seeing that 10% of all of my sales are coming from Argentina. How do I actually act upon the hypothesis that there's probably more people that do want to transact with me? Our view is you need to think differently, meaning you have to think about how do I let people in Argentina pay the way that they would pay if they were purchasing from me in country? How do I let people that are in country be able to have an experience that allows me to have a very low cost, make it feel from a financial perspective like a credit card transaction, and as well to make sure that I'm optimizing for my optionality. Time and time again, what we see when merchants talk to us is that they say, I really wanted to go international, and what I did is I solved for Brazil. And then suddenly I started to see traffic from another country. And I didn't do anything on the second country because I did a one-off integration into a Brazilian provider, or I did a one-off integration into an Argentinian provider. And suddenly, when I started to experience traffic across Latin America, because I had a Spanish-speaking influencer, because I had a Portuguese-speaking influencer, because somehow my product really hit it off with the Indian market, I got myself stuck because what I did is I was either focusing too much on credit cards, or I did a one-off integration, I did a one-off contract with one particular provider, and then ultimately found that when I started seeing traffic from other geographies, I didn't have the engineering resources, I didn't have the ability to go off and do another integration. So ultimately, the way that our platform works is that we say, we can give you access to 100 different countries, over 500 different payment methods with one single integration, and you can actually pick and choose which ones you want to use and only have to do one integration, one contract, and then as you expand into other markets, be able to expand into those. So that's about 20 minutes or so of presentation. Happy to take any other questions. If people have questions about us or about what we've seen in cross-border transactions, happy to answer.
So you mentioned Adyen. Are you a competitor to Adyen?
Most definitely.
Yeah, that's right.
Most definitely.
I'd like to talk to you privately after.
Yeah.
There was a bullet on installment payments. Do you offer functionality for installments for some of those countries that are using?
Yeah, there's a subset of countries where, so I'll answer that in two different ways. So very good question. Are there installment payments? So it's actually, credit cards when they originally created in the US were perceived as a line of credit, right? Fast forward, they continued from a bank's perspective to be a very lucrative form of revenue because there's a subset of the population that does actually use a credit card as a line of credit. But yet there's a very large population in developed markets such as the US that is not using the credit card as a form of credit, but is just using it as a digital transactional mechanism. And as a digital transaction mechanism, it's a source of revenue for the issuing banks, and it's a source of cost for merchants. Overseas, the ability to actually, the way that that credit works is very different. So the way that credit works in Brazil is very, very few people have a true credit card, but instead when you check out online or you check out at a retailer, even at physical retail, what the merchant will ask you is, do you want to pay in installments? And what that ultimately means is, do you want to pay where the transaction gets authorized for the full amount of, let's say, $100, but you as a consumer are actually paying, let's say, $11 for 10 months. And it's that $10 revenue that is generating, that is the credit line that you're issuing to the consumer. So there are a subset of markets where we do support that model. What we're also beginning to see is that model that has existed for a very long time in countries such as Brazil, countries such as Argentina, countries such as Mexico, is actually, interesting enough, is now coming to the US. Because more and more what people are finding is that what they like about installments is that it provides them visibility into how much does it actually cost me. Where when you're dealing with an APR, even those of us that have business degrees or studied math, figuring out what the APR is quite confusing and typically speaking gets widely out of control for most consumers. So the ability to offer an installment payment is a way to overcome that consumer resistance.
Does it really make sense to ship to other countries? I mean, even if I want to sell there, I would have to charge a lot more for shipping and probably duties and all that. From your experience, from your customers, is that something that's...
So the answer is depends on the purchase price, and it depends on how you've optimized for fulfillment. But we have some of the world's largest e-com platforms using our platforms that are shipping cross-border every single day. So depending upon the product that you're selling, you would, from our perspective, you'd say, hold on, so it's going to cost me $15 to do a cross-border shipment to Mexico, but it only costs me $2 to do a shipment from my fulfillment center in wherever, California to Florida. I don't think anyone's ever going to have the willingness to pay $15. Depends what you're shipping. Certain goods in some of these markets can be anywhere between 50 to 100% more expensive, or ultimately they're not even available whatsoever. And the example that I would like to give is, so when I used to live in China, and when my son was born, what you would see is people were essentially getting subscriptions for formula because no one trusted the formula. Both Chinese nationals and expats living in China, what they would do is we would travel to Hong Kong and we would buy, and if you've ever been to Hong Kong and walked around the streets of Hong Kong, what you actually see is you see smoke shops where people are buying cigarettes, and out front they're selling baby formula because no one trusted. So the ability to actually say, why are people willing to get on a plane to go buy baby formula? Why are people willing to get on a plane to go shopping in Miami before their kid is born to buy the stroller? Is because the cost of actually getting those goods and the variety of options that they have in country are so much less than the variety of options that they have in the US, that I would say that yes, there's a huge willingness to buy depending upon what you're selling. And there's a handful of partners that we have and other people that are here, whether it's a Border Free, or whether it's a Farfetch, or whether it's a Global E. And these are specialized companies that are facilitating, helping merchants localize their websites and do international fulfillment and optimize it in a way that you're not literally shipping one box to Mexico, but your box is maybe going with a handful of other boxes to optimize that you're filling container, and then they're getting distributed locally in country. And I think the other way I think that I would answer that question is, where do you think your growth is going to come from otherwise? Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.